Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not unmute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the page, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. Presenters will then call on participants to unmute their microphones and unmute their microphones. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rosine Foley via the chat box or at rfoley@ctps.org or by calling her at 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Regine Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or at 857-702-3704. Welcome everyone to the meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller. I represent Secretary Jamie Tesla here. Jonathan, please call the roll.
Okay, thank you. MassDOT C2. Okay, MassDOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA. Okay, we'll come back. Massachusetts Port Authority. Okay, MAPC. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board present.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council. Okay. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department. City of Boston BPDA. I'm just getting a message that some people aren't allowed to unmute. I'm wondering if they're having trouble unmuting to do their response. Matt, do we know?
I am prompting people to unmute. We might want to circle back and go through some folks, as I've seen some people arrive as we've been doing the roll call.
Okay. I'll keep going and then I'll go back. At-large City of Everett.
Good morning, Jay Monty, representing Mayor DiMaria in the city of Everett.
Thank you. At-large City of Newton.
Good morning, David Kozas, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the city of Newton.
Okay. At-large Town of Arlington.
Good morning, Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
Great. At-large Town of Brookline.
Good morning, Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Inner Core.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Austin Saganowitz, Town of Acton, representing the Magic Sub-Region.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keys are representing Mayor Spicer, Framingham.
North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing Mayor Mike Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the North Suburban Planning Council.
South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland.
Jennifer Constable, Town of Rockland, representing the South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Town of Medway, Pete Pelletier, present.
Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Chamber.
Tom O'Rourke, present.
Thank you. I will go back to our members. MassDOT seat 2.
John Bouchard, present.
Thank you. MBTA.
Jillian Linnell, representing General Manager Steve Poftak.
Thank you. I'll do one more time. Massachusetts Port Authority. Okay. MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council here. I'm having computer problems. I'm going to be in and out a bit for a little while. Okay, thank you.
Okay. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department. Okay, I will go to our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Jonathan, you skipped BPDA.
Oh, I'm so sorry. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hi, sorry for being a couple minutes late. Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA representing City of Boston. Thanks.
Thank you. Ex officio, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway Administration.
And Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one, so we'll go directly to the executive director's report. Taken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to be continuing our conversation that we've been having about the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, including 3 general areas. One is the first, sort of the current federal fiscal year, which is federal fiscal year 21, and the project cost increases and readiness updates related to this year. In addition, the cost increases, the readiness updates, and the new projects for consideration for the federal fiscal year 22 through 26 TIP, which you will vote out for public comment later in April. And then third, the longer term, more systematic, policy-driven approach that you've been thinking about and discussing for how you want to anticipate and address the cost and readiness challenges that the projects in the TIP often face. So I would like to do a little context setting for this meeting, but first, just a couple of outreach and public comment highlights. First of all, since the last MPO meeting, we have received 135 written comments on 7 different projects, and those will be shared with you shortly. We are also in the process, in terms of outreach, of hosting focus groups for the UPWP study that's called Informing the Big Ideas for the MPO Scenario Planning Process. And those focus groups are discussing the uncertainties and trends in our region's transportation system in order to inform the development of plausible future scenarios that we can incorporate into the next long-range transportation plan, or LRTP. Those are taking place this month and early April. And then thirdly, there's an event tomorrow, March 19th at 1 p.m., which is the next Pilot Transit Working Group meeting. So please join us. We'll talk about the MBTA's regional rail transformation, as well as the MPO developed MBTA park and ride and bicycle parking dashboard. among other items. So please go check out the MPO website for the Zoom link and the agenda. So back to today, it's a big day for discussion. You'll see that we really only have the tip as the main item on the agenda. Our goals today in this conversation is to support you having, the board having discussion that allows you to explore different ways to approach this year of the tip as well as the FY22 to 26 tip. Our other goal is to support your likely longer term conversation that's going to be continuing about a policy that you might set that would affect future tips. So we have sort of the short term, this tip, as well as the longer term conversation to have with you. For this tip, there are really two kind of buckets of options. One is to fund the cost changes as you've historically done, with maybe a few variations. And then the other is to consider changing the approach, which would involve potentially delaying or removing projects. And that would allow you to consider newly scored, newly submitted projects that are kind of out there for mostly 2026 in the tip. You'll notice that there have been some additional readiness updates from what we discussed at the last MPO meeting, and I'll let Matt Genova discuss that with you. But what that means is that today you're not just discussing over-programmed years, which the baseline scenario you've seen before attempts to even out, but you're also discussing an under-programmed next year and the federal fiscal year 2022, which means that it has a surplus due to readiness changes. So in the next few weeks, you also have to decide how you want to address that surplus in FY22. You could discuss whether there are other eligible projects to consider programming, whether you want to keep the surplus, leaving room for cost increases next year, or whether you want to consider both, but just take more time to get more information about eligible projects or what cost might look like. So to support all of that conversation, you may have seen we managed to post yesterday. I know it was just before the meeting, but there was a lot to do to pull it together. We posted some usual and unusual approaches or scenarios to programming the tip, as well as a write-up that documents kind of the assumptions around those, as well as our interpretation of the advantages and disadvantages to doing those things. They are not intended to be recommendations. I know seeing the removal of a project can be a bit contentious, but these scenarios are intended to feed your conversation, to give you something to discuss in terms of the different ways to approach the challenges that the projects in the tip are facing. So what we need at the end of this meeting as staff from you is direction from the board for a final or a close to final scenario that you'd like us to bring to you next week for your approval. The reason why we need that next week is that gives us these several weeks that we need to then finalize the tip document based on that selected programming scenario. Now, what we also like at the end of this meeting is a sense of your desired next steps in that policy conversation that would really affect and come into play for future tips. So, and if desired, we can continue to come back to you with more information and presentation, scenarios, things like that over the next several months. So with that, the next board meeting is 1 week away. So please mark that on your calendar. It's usually 2 weeks apart, but we'll be meeting next week on March 25th to discuss that final scenario. In addition to that, we'll also be talking about the Mass DOT's Capital Investment Plan or CIP development process and how it connects to the TIP. And then you'll also be hearing about the RTA capital planning processes for Cape Ann Transportation Authority or CATA and the Metro West Regional Transit Authority, WRTA. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan from the members? Seeing none, I'd like to go back for a second to the roll call because Bill Conroy from BTD is here in place of Tom Katzis. So Jonathan, can you, or Matt, can you unmute Bill so he can say present and we can note him here for the record?
Hi, Bill Conroy, City of Boston, representing Mayor Walsh. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.
Next up is public comments. If you have a public comment you'd like to make at this time, please raise your hand so we can call on you. And when we do call on you, please state your name and affiliation if you have one for the record. All right, so Matt, for some reason I can see that there are 6 people who have their hands raised, but they're not actually showing up on my screen by name. So Matt, can you call on them as you see them come up, and Jonathan will unmute them and we'll listen. Oh wait, now they're showing up. Never mind, Matt. I got them now. They're showing up. Thank you, Matt. We'll take Aaron Clausen first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Aaron Clausen from the City of Lynn.
Municipal planner. I also have on the call with us today, Andrew Hall, DPW Commissioner, ready to answer any questions the board might have. I wanted to take a moment just to provide an update to our Linfield Street project. As you may recall, a couple weeks ago, Mayor McGee was here speaking strongly in support of this project. It's very important to us. I won't go into the details of the need and value to the region. I think the MPO board has supported this project, and we appreciate that. As you probably know, it was programmed for 22 and currently is, and there's a recommendation due to concerns to push out to FY23. I just wanted to provide some updates and to provide some comfort that the city is committed to this project and able to meet our requirements for a bid opening for March of 22 and feel that it could stay in the current TIP program year and would ask the board consider to retain it in that year. A couple things just to point out: we've been working with MassDOT, meeting with progress meetings on a weekly basis for the last couple months, particularly around concerns that were raised around right-of-way, environmental permitting, and believe we had a meeting yesterday where there was an agreement and comfort level on all parties with the city and MassDOT that we could meet our deadlines for the right-of-way for that bid opening. And then also we have, we've been doing title work in advance of that. We'll be bringing on an appraisal very shortly and have funds in place to complete that work in a timely fashion. Just a couple other notes too. We as the mayor had mentioned a couple weeks ago, had our public hearing, design public hearing, the 25% back in October. Very limited concerns raised at that point. Strong support from the community to move this project forward. And our expectation is that we will be submitting our 75% design plans by the end of this month, along with, that is consistent with our timeline. And so we're committed to and able to meet that. So I just wanted to point those two updates out. We feel like we've been able to meet with MassDOT and get on the same page in terms of timing and believe that they would be able to corroborate that. And then just to point out a couple other projects that we are also supporting the city here. Essex Street, which is programmed for FY24. I don't think there's much to say there. That's moving along, and we're appreciative of the board's support on that project, and look forward to working with you all and MassDOT in moving that forward expeditiously. And then finally, Western Ave is under consideration, I believe, for 26. And we'll just state, this is an incredibly important project for us in the city and the region. And I think as you go through the scoring, I believe later today, you'll see just how well it is aligned with the objectives of the MPO board. So anyway, thank you for your time. And if there's any questions, happy to answer those.
Thank you, Mr. Clausen. Any questions from the members at this time? Seeing none. Next public speaker is Roger Talcott. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Hi, good morning. Roger Talcott, calling as a resident of the town of Swampscott and town meeting member, and also rail trail supporter over the last 22 years. I don't think it should become any surprise to the board that the average time it takes to construct a trail in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is over 20 years. We've been working on this project now or I have with many other people for over 22 years. And I'm calling just to encourage the board's support to continue to work towards helping us with this project. This trail is an important project for the town of Swampscott. It will attach to the Marblehead and Salem Trail and also other parts of the North Shore. One of the important things about this rail trail is the fact that it will connect the middle school, the new proposed elementary school, and also the train station for people of the town of Swampscott and Marblehead. We'll hopefully be able to commute by bicycle or walking to the train station to get to points north and south on the train. In all, this trail will be an incredibly efficient corridor for the town and neighboring towns. And I would hope for the board's support and continued support on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tupper. Next up is Grant Ellis.
Hello, Mr. Chair. Thank you for hearing my comments today. My name is Grant Ellis. I'm a resident of the town of Belmont. Although I've lived in a few different places, I've maintained at least one residence here for over 30 years, which has been my entire life. And I'm speaking today in support of the Belmont Community Path. And I'm asking for the consideration that the MPO provide tip funding for the Belmont Community Path as soon as possible. Not only do I support the Central Rail Trail project, but the Belmont component of the rail trail is crucial for a number of reasons, because not only of the way that it will be able to link other paths in the region that already exist, but also because it will provide a viable and accessible transportation pathway by foot or by bike from where I am in Belmont, right on Concord Ave across from Clay Pit Pond, into downtown Boston via Alewife, and also to the wider 104-mile Central Rail Trail, both in Northampton, Boston, and otherwise. So allowing Belmont to have the funding necessary to help complete the Central Rail Trail will benefit not only the citizens of Belmont like myself, but also the wider construction of the Central Rail Trail. And I'm very grateful for your consideration of my comments today, and I do hope you will provide full funding to the Belmont Community Path in this year's funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Next up is Glenn Clancy.
Mr. Chair, hi, Glenn Clancy, Director of Community Development in the town of Belmont. I'm here to speak about the same project, the Belmont Path. It is MassDOT project number 609204. Mr. Ellis was very eloquent in describing the benefits of the path, so I will skip over my comments in that regard. I just would like to update the MPO on the status and the progress that we're making on the project. We are very close to submitting our 25% design drawings. We hope to have them submitted later on this spring. We had a meeting with the MBTA earlier this week. It was a very productive meeting. We got some great feedback. I would almost characterize the comments as almost post 25% comments in the feedback that we got. So it was very, very beneficial to us because we'll be able to incorporate that feedback into the 25% design before we submit. So that was really helpful. Want the MPO to know that the design, the funding for this project is coming from the town of Belmont to $1.4 million from community preservation funding has come from the town of Belmont through town meeting. We've also been utilizing $50,000 rail trails grant, Mass Trails grant as well. So I think that's really just what I wanted to say. I just wanted the MPO to know that we are moving forward. 25% submittal will be in the next couple of months. And we hope that you keep our project on the radar and know that we are moving forward with design with the idea that we will hopefully meet at the end of this process with programming for construction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clancy. Cosmo Caterino.
Hi, my name's Cosmo Caterino. I'm a resident of Belmont. And thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'd like to make a brief statement about the proposed project in Belmont that you'll be considering. There are two opposing factions in Belmont regarding the proposal for the rail trail. And I understand you'll be receiving a letter from the town disparaging some of the letters already provided to the MPO. And they have solicited Wells Brownsburger to come make a statement. And they're also starting a letter writing campaign to you as well. So you'll receive many more letters, I understand. Ironically, the letter does the same thing that accuses, the abutters of. And we could debate these facts for hours, but I'd rather just state a few brief facts that I think would be of interest to the towns competing for the funding. And I'm talking about indisputable facts because they can be found in the public record for the public meetings and the consultant reports. Belmont has had 3 committees evaluating the bike path locations. I was on the first of the 3. I have a master's in civil engineering with an environmental concentration. I thought I could help with the contamination issue. But in particular, I would just like to discuss the disregard for the control of spending on the project. Currently, the town's proposing a rail trail on the north side of the Fitchburg line. This was not always the case. Belmont hired Park Consulting to conduct a feasibility study. The consultant's report identified a path south of the Fitchburg line that would not be adjacent to the rail trail and cost $3.9 million less. This was just for a half-mile segment. The full cost would probably for the whole path through Belmont to be about $30 million. What is worse is that the other two multi-use paths proposed as alternatives to the above mentioned options are actually being developed in conjunction with the new high school. It'll probably be finished in another year, making this segment actually unnecessary. In fact, the developer for the high school offered to allow space for a third path on the south side, which I previously mentioned. So really a savings of about $5 million. Not giving opinions here, I'm just stating facts from the consultant's feasibility study. It's $5 million that could be used for other projects. So you might wonder why Belmont is choosing this more expensive path. And I'm just going to state a few more facts. In 2008, a private organization, the Belmont Citizens Forum, bought a strip of former rail line adjacent to the current active rail line and approached the butters. Upset abutters approached the town of Belmont. In a letter from the town administrator, it was stated that the project is a private venture which has not had any town involvement. So this started out as a private venture. In 2012, Belmont formed a path committee. That's the first one that I mentioned that I was on, to identify potential routes. This committee was followed by 2 additional committees. The only person on all 3 committees was an officer of the Belmont Citizens Forum, the private venture that I had mentioned earlier. In 2017, the Park Corporation submitted a feasibility study for the path recommending the south side of the rail line. The Board of Selectmen accepted this recommendation. This was opposed by the Belmont Citizens Forum and Will Brownsberger, who put a statement on his website urging the town to reconsider. At a public meeting, the Board of Selectmen expressed their concern that they would not receive state funding if they continued on the preferred, cheaper path, and asked PAR to reevaluate aspects of the feasibility study. The report was revised and it now favored the route that was favored by the Citizens Forum. I asked at a public meeting, again, recorded in the public record, this was a Board of Selectmen meeting, about the $3.9 million of additional costs changing the path route. Selectman Adam Dash replied that these costs would be construction costs, which the state was paying for and not his concern. Again, in the record, I'm just stating facts. You can draw your own conclusions why we're asking for an additional $3 to $5 million. And I just want to thank you for your time. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Caterino. Next up, Jay Carroll.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your time. My name is Jay Carroll. I'm with the Salem Engineering Department, and I'm speaking on behalf of Mayor Kim Driscoll of Salem. This is for the Boston Street Corridor Improvement Project. So just to remind everybody, this is about a mile-long project, starting at Howley Street in Peabody, going along Boston Street through Salem to the intersection of Essex, and then from Essex Street, it's going to continue up to Jackson, which is going to tie into where the proposed Route 107 corridor improvements began. So that's what I think this project stemmed from, was that Route 107 corridor study back in 2016, which had some recommendations for improvements to the intersection at Boston and Essex. And then we also have a lot of housing and economic development that's sprouting up in that North River Canal corridor, which is right at Boston and Bridge Street. So with all that coming into play, and with from Peabody Main Street coming into Boston Street and the connection to the MBTA regional train station, this seemed to make sense to be the next piece for improvements. Was the Boston Street corridor. So to date, with the project status of where we're at, the city has submitted 25% plans last year, and also the right-of-way plans that are still in review by the state. And we're currently going through the utility coordination with District 4, And we hope to have that resolved in the next couple of months and to be able to schedule the design public hearing. And then in hopes of that, as we keep moving forward, see if we can get to that 75%, maybe by the end of this year, 2021. And with that, we're hoping that like maybe by late 2023 or 2024 is where we're thinking we might have a shovel-ready project here on Boston Street. So I hope as you're looking at your scenarios, you'll consider this, and we're going to follow up these comments that I'm making with a written memo next week for the meeting, when we have a link to a project website that's got a story map. It's a very concise way to, if you need any more detail on the project, it's a good thing to just flip through if you have 5-10 minutes to look at it. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Next up, Will Pullitz of Peabody.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the MPO for allowing me to speak this morning. My name is William Pullitz with the City of Peabody. I'm the city engineer and wanted to speak on Central Street, which for the city is an important project. It'll connect downtown Peabody to Route 128 and also the North Shore Mall via Route 114. And the project has the full support of Mayor Ted Betancourt and the Peabody City Council. And as part of the project, the city is looking to invest about an additional $2 million in a new water main infrastructure as part of this project out of the city's funding. In addition, National Grid is looking to upgrade gas mains along this corridor and is looking to start construction this construction season to start that infrastructure upgrade. In respect to our budget, it has gone up. Our budget was initially the initial budget came into effect prior to the 25% design plans. So I just want to let the MPO know that there's been no scope increase and the project limits have remained the same. And currently right now we're working with World Tech and they're revising or have the revised right-of-way plans back into Mass DOT at this point, and we're looking to have our design public hearing in May of this year. And we're hoping to have 75% design plans to Mass DOT by January. So thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Pullitz. Next up is Beth Sudemeyer.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Moeller and members of the board for the opportunity to comment. I'm Beth Sudemeyer with the Town of Sudbury Planning and Community Development Department, and I'd like to speak to the project, the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Sudbury and Concord. It's number 608164. And I really want to thank you for your dedication to this important transportation work and certainly recognize how challenging this year is for you as you negotiate the programming. And I don't want to take a lot of time because I know you have much work to do, but I do want to provide an update on where we stand with the project. We're advancing towards the 75% design and have made a lot of very positive progress with the design team and a lot of significant public outreach that's transpired and now been supported by the select board. So we're on track to deliver the 75% design to Mass DOT in April. And are very excited about how the project is coming together. We're continuing to coordinate with Mass DOT staff regarding the environmental permitting requirements and the right-of-way. And we're happy that they've acknowledged that they don't have concerns about the ability for the project to deliver in spring of 2022, and that they've supported it along with the MPO staff, as is recognized in the scenarios that are before you today. And we really appreciate everyone and the support of the project that has led to us being proposed to be retained in the 2022 programming year. We certainly believe we're on track to deliver this project on time, and it's been a long-term goal regionally and within the town of Sudbury to advance the rail trail through Concord and into Sudbury. And we request your support to continue programming this for the 2022 year. I'll be available to answer any questions as they might arise, as well as members of our design team from Fuss & O'Neill. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sudemeyer. Next up is Jennifer Roberts.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Roberts. I'm Vice Chair of the Sudbury Select Board, and I also want to comment briefly on the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail project. Thank you so much, Beth, for her comments. But I just really want to express my appreciation for your continued support to keep it on the 2022 tip, as well as for the ongoing communication, particularly as of late, about the progress for the project. And as I know, you've heard many times, this is a long anticipated and supported project by Sudbury and many other communities in the region. And it's my sense and certainly hope that we're on the cusp of something really special. So I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Next up, Sean Fitzgerald.
Right. Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm here today to talk about the Swampscott Rail Trail. We're really excited to really have a shovel-ready project. You know, we're in the middle of COVID, and frankly, I really appreciate the work of the board. You know, it's my hope that you can keep some of these projects that really help us stay healthy as a community as we deal with all these complicated challenges with COVID, really get the funding and stay on schedule. I understand the complexity of cost overruns and projects and meeting the critical need of transportation, but these projects that support you know, intermodal opportunities and pedestrian opportunities are so critical. Swampscott is ready to play a role in the region in connecting our trail system, and we're excited to work with our MPO and DOT to really advance this critical project. So please continue your incredible work, but you know, keep projects that are ready to go in queue, because we need it. We need it not only as a community, but the economy needs it, and you know, we're excited to get going. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. Peter Spelios.
Good morning. My name is Peter Spelios. I'm the chair of the Swampscott Select Board. Sean Fitzgerald's our town administrator. I'm here to speak in support of construction project 610666, which is the Swampscott Rail Trail. I've got to admit, I'm envious when I hear my neighboring communities of Lynn and Salem talk about all their projects and their success with the TIP program, and they've done a wonderful job with their community. This is Swampscott's first TIP project, and it's reflective of an evolution of town government with great professional success, thanks to Sean Fitzgerald and others. 2017, the town of Swampscott, overwhelmingly by townwide referendum, approved the Swampscott Rail Trail and authorized almost $1 million for the full design and acquisition of rights necessary for that trail. The select board unanimously supports it, and it has the support of all major committees in the town of Swampscott. I want to thank our MassDOT project manager for all the direction she has given us to help us. We're currently responding to modifications to our 25% design. The Swampscott Rail Trail is only 2 miles, but it's the most important 2 miles. We are the 5th most dense community in Massachusetts, and frankly, safe streets and intermodal paths are critical to accommodate the concerns in our community. It will connect to the Northern Strand Community Bike Path, Bike to the Sea in Swampscott and Marblehead, and it's part of the East Coast Greenway. Showing our commitment, the town of Swampscott, in addition to doing the design and expending significant funds to get this far, has also constructed 2 small segments of this trail as a demonstration project to our neighboring communities, to the town of Swampscott, and to you all of the town's commitment. It is critical. The TIP support is critical, and I couldn't agree more with the town administrator's request of you all, which we appreciate. There's a number of projects whose costs have increased over time, but it's important that that doesn't squeeze out other opportunities like the town of Swampscott and other merit-based projects from joining the TIP list and having a successful future like so many communities have. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Spelios. Beth Parent.
Good morning. My name is Beth Parent. I'm a project manager at Tetra Tech, and I'm here today on behalf of the town of Ipswich to give a brief overview of the County Street project. Since it's a new project this year, I have a few slides to share, and I'll run through them quickly. County Street in Ipswich is an urban minor arterial that connects South Main Street, State Route 133, and East Street. South of the project area, South Main Street turns northwest toward the downtown area of Ipswich. County Street continues north, bypassing the downtown towards recreational areas located along the Ipswich River and eventually leading to Pavilion Beach in Great Neck and Little Neck. County Street, including the bridge over Ipswich River, provides a critical linkage along the Ipswich River Walk for residents and tourists. The street landing and Sawmill Point open space recreational areas are also located on County Street. The Ipswich commuter rail station is located about 0.4 miles from the County Street Bridge. And the Ipswich Essex Explorer bus route connects the train station with destination stops in Ipswich and Essex, including a stop at the Ipswich Visitor Center on South Main Street, where tourists can disembark for a walking tour of the historic homes on County Street, East Street, and High Street. And the proposed project area extends about 2,400 feet from South Main Street to East Street. Next slide. The existing cross-section of the roadway is constrained within a narrow right-of-way, resulting in narrow sidewalks and shoulders. In some cases, there are historic homes located right at the back of sidewalk. Existing sidewalks and wheelchair ramps are not consistently provided on both sides of the road within the project area, and they do not all meet ADA standards. Next slide. The County Street Bridge over Ipswich River, which is in the project area, is a historic stone arch bridge that's in fair condition with structural deficiencies that were noted during bridge inspection. The bridge rehabilitation study from March 2018 identifies 3 rehabilitation alternatives to address the existing deficiencies. And in addition to the structural deficiencies, there are no existing sidewalks on the bridge, and the existing bridge guardrail doesn't meet current design criteria for safety. Next slide. The proposed complete streets and safety improvements will increase bikeability, walkability, and accessibility within the project corridor. Rehabilitation of County Street Bridge over Ipswich River will address existing structural and safety deficiencies. The project will add sidewalks and wheelchair ramps that meet ADA standards, signing and pavement markings to better define bicycle and pedestrian accommodation, and rehabilitation of the bridge, including adding a shared use path on one side and replacing the bridge guardrail, as well as repairing or replacing the existing water main support over the bridge and reconstructing the pavement wearing surface. Next slide. This is the proposed concept plan that highlights the opportunity for proposed pedestrian and bicycle signing and new pavement markings. The proposed shared use path is shown between Poplar and South Main Street and the Riverwalk path just over the bridge, and proposed sidewalks and wheelchair ramps are shown for the remainder of the corridor where they're currently lacking or deteriorated. And final slide. The project will address 3 main evaluation criteria with the following improvements. The project will improve the substandard and deteriorated roadway and bridge and sidewalk, addressing system preservation. The project will improve pedestrian and bicycle network, ADA accessibility, intermodal accommodation, and connection to transit, addressing mobility. The project will increase safety by addressing existing infrastructure deficiencies. And the proposed improvements will increase the safety on this important bypass of the downtown area for bicycles and pedestrians and fill an existing gap in the mobility network in this area with high potential for everyday biking. Bicycle and pedestrian access to the recreational open space along County Street will also benefit from the proposed infrastructure improvements, pavement markings, and signing. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to present to you this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Parent. Next up is Ben Cares.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Board. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak towards 2 projects that Chelsea has in the TIP process. The first being Upper Broadway, which is programmed for FY22. I did look back at the spreadsheet that we have for the cost increase. It looks like we've reconciled our overall difference down to a number that coincides with our actual estimate, so that's good. We do recognize that the project saw a cost increase, but the value of the project and its intersectionality with our ongoing infrastructure efforts makes it a competitive project that we're looking forward to implementing. The value of it being for denser residential areas of Chelsea, but connecting some of the nodes of Chelsea and regional entities like East Boston, Revere, as well as several major MBTA bus lines enjoying the roadway, and then looking to implement some pavement markings to improve the functionality of the roadway along with some intelligent signalization. So a good project all in all in terms of a surface improvement from an engineering standpoint. Just a brief update on the schedule where we stand with the right-of-way process. We are getting a steady intake of responses to our temporary and permanent easement packages that we sent out with our appraisal team that we have on contract. They'll be formally complete with their appraisal process review and reporting by early April, which puts us in a good space for interfacing with the 126 property owners for these easements. So that's good to hear, and that puts us right on track for bidding out the project sometime in December of 2021. Moreover, we reviewed the 75% comments from Mass DOT with our engineers at Weston and Sampson, formulated responses for that. And so we are also on track for submitting our 100% design to Mass DOT. The other project I wanted to speak to was the Pearl and Park Street project, which was submitted in the most recent TIP process. And it scored highly amongst other projects, both from the environmental justice and equity standpoint, but also from the functionality of it. Both of these projects are complementary to ongoing utility reconstruction in the area, which is set up by the initiatives of our water and sewer department. So we're coming in once they're completed and doing some significant roadway and surface reconstruction to improve the functionality and safety of these roadways, which again are adjacent to highly dense residential and commercial areas of Chelsea. So we appreciate the positive scoring we've received on our past projects and now this project as well. We look forward to continue to work with the board and others to continue that project forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karras. Sarah Smith.
Hi, I'm Sarah Smith with the Executive Board of the Friends of Belmont Community Path. And I just wanted to point out that in the CTPS website, the map and description for the Belmont Community Path is currently showing what Mr. Cosentino was talking about, the south route for phase 1. So the town has approved the north route, and that's what we're in design on. So for lots of different reasons, for instance, the south route would require people to cross an active railroad at grade. So I'm not going to go into all of the reasons, but I just wanted to point out that the incorrect information is on attachment A on ctps.org.
Thank you, Mrs.
Thank you.
Emily Teller.
Thank you very much for recognizing me, and I appreciate the time that the MPO is spending on all these projects. It's exciting to see a lot. I just wanted to let you know I'm here, and I will speak if necessary for the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail Phase 2D into Sudbury and Concord. And there are 2 former members of the select board from Sudbury and 2 current members of the select board and 3 community members. So we're 20% of what you got here. So anyway, thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Ms. Teller. Miranda Briseno.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to speak in favor of the Medford-Malden application under the Community Connections Program for a Blue Bike expansion. We're hoping to add 3 stations in each of our communities. The project funding would be really crucial to provide connections to other Blue Bike communities that surround Medford and Malden, like Somerville, Cambridge, Arlington, Everett, Boston, and more. Further, I just wanted the board to know that Medford is committed to this expansion, as we are also soliciting other funding so that we can expand past the initial 3 stations in our application. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments at this time? Seeing none, if you have a comment during the meeting, please raise your, oh wait, Sophia Gallimore.
Hi, good morning. I am Sophia Gallimore, and I am here to represent the Watertown Transportation Management Association in reference to the Pleasant Street corridor shuttle application that we have submitted. I believe last time I did briefly talk about it, and I just wanted everyone to know that the Watertown town is definitely committed to getting this portion of the corridor equipped with the shuttle to assist again with our transportation needs in the Watertown area. We do have, we have secured our matching funds for this particular project, and we'd definitely like for you all to, consider us for grant funding. So I'm here as well if there's any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Gallimore.
Thank you.
Any other comments at this time? Seeing none, if you have a comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will try to call on you. Next up is the committee chairs reports. Are there any? Seeing none. Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the Advisory Council had a meeting on this past Wednesday, and it was pretty much a review of the situation that we have with the current TIP and the 2026 TIP, and also we had an introduction to the preliminary universe meeting of studies with EPWP. We'll be commenting a bit more, on what happened in the meeting when we discuss potential policy changes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from February 4th. Can I get a motion and a second from a member to approve the minutes, and please state your name for the record. Patrick Keyser.
I move to approve the minutes of February 4th.
Thank you. Tina Cassidy.
And I would second that motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded, are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing none, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
William Conroy,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowicz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the discussion of the TIP, and Matt's going to lead us through it. I'd like to, before Matt starts, remind everybody that we decided to have a policy discussion today, and we asked staff to prepare information that would be challenging and interesting, and that's what they've done. So Matt, you're up.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good morning, everyone. Excited for another TIP conversation. So today, my colleague, Sandy Johnston, and I will discuss the scoring results for new projects being considered for funding this year. I'll also review a handful of draft programming scenarios for the federal fiscal years 22 through 26 Transportation Improvement Program. So here's the ground that I hope to cover today. I'll start by highlighting the key goals and questions we need to work through today, followed by a quick reminder of where we are on this year's TIP development timeline. I'll take a few minutes to review both the project level updates and the written public comments submitted to this board since the last MPO meeting on March 4th. From there, we'll dive into the main portion of the presentation, which is split between an overview of all the prospective TIP projects scored for funding this year and additional TIP programming scenarios for the fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP. In closing, I'll touch on a handful of next steps before opening things up for a discussion. I also want to take a quick second before we start to say thank you to all the MPO staff members who jumped in to lend a hand with developing programming scenarios and with pulling together project information for this week. Specifically, I'd like to give a shout out to Michelle Scott, Betsy Harvey, Sandy Johnston, and Ariel Patterson, all of whom were integral in preparing the materials that we'll discuss today. So before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to several files posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date, all of which can be resources for you as we proceed through the presentation and discussion. Available for your review are 3 draft programming scenario tables, along with a short guide that explains the approaches taken to arrive at each scenario. Also available are a compilation of the written public comments submitted to this board since our last meeting on March 4th, 2 handouts containing 1-page summaries of every project currently programmed in the TIP, as well as every new project seeking funding this year. And finally, a 2-page table that provides some additional notes on currently funded projects that have significant readiness updates or cost changes. This last table is a compilation of some of the takeaways from this board's last couple of meetings, so much of this information should be fairly familiar. To set up today's discussion, I want to highlight here at the outset the chief goals and questions to consider as we move through the presentation. There are 2 main goals for today. First, it's important that this board build consensus on an approach to creating a final draft scenario or scenarios to be approved at next week's MPO meeting for public review. Second, this board should discuss a path forward on policy changes. Should discuss a path forward on policy changes for cost increases and other programming related issues. This discussion can involve both short-term and long-term components, or in other words, an approach to this year's TIP, as well as a path forward for future TIPs. There you go. There are also 3 key policy questions that should be considered today, the answers to which will help us achieve the meeting goals that I just outlined. First, the question of, does the MPO want to continue funding all project cost changes in line with historical practice? Second, does the MPO want to make more funds available for new projects this year, even if that means delaying or removing other existing projects? And third, if the MPO wants to fund more new projects this year, with what metrics should decisions on adding or removing projects be made? So before we dive in, it's always useful to remind ourselves of sort of where we are in the TIP process. It sets out what's to come in the coming days here. So as I noted earlier, today's conversation will be focused on a discussion of a preliminary scenario for the fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP. So between today and next week's MPO, will be included in the draft TIP that we anticipate releasing for public review in late April. All of that puts us on track for a final TIP endorsement by this board in late May. So as I've done over the last few meetings, I'll now quickly review any notable changes in project status or cost since our last meeting. There are 5 updates that I want to draw your attention to, all of which will shape the programming scenarios this board can consider for the fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP. First, as was raised during the discussion on March 4th, the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue in Boston has been updated to reflect the new local funding being contributed by the city, as well as the project's recommendation to move to fiscal year 2023 based on current readiness. Second, at our last meeting, some questions were raised about the cost discrepancy between MPO staff materials and materials presented by MassDOT's Highway Division. This is on the project in Chelsea on Broadway. And as you heard during public comment today from Ben Cares in Chelsea, those numbers have been updated. And so all the materials should reflect the current correct cost of the score or of the project. Third, the Route 3A project in Cohasset and Scituate saw a cost increase of just over $4 million. This This project is currently funded in federal fiscal year 2024 and has a new total cost of roughly $12 million. Fourth, as you heard from the city earlier, recent conversations between MassDOT's Highway Division and the City of Lynn have determined that the Linfield Street project may be eligible to stay in its current programming year of 2022. And finally, this has been mentioned during public comments in the last 2 MPO meetings, but the town of Watertown has requested that funding for Mount Auburn Street be delayed by 1 year until 2023 due to concerns about the project's ability to make its current 2022 advertisement. So I'd like to highlight some of the public comments that we've received on TIP projects since this board met on March 4th. And as always, you can review the full text of these comments on the meeting calendar on the MPO website. So over the last 2 weeks, we've received 135 written comments on seven different current and prospective TIP projects. As in previous weeks, I want to extend my thanks to all project proponents and other stakeholders who have attended today's meeting, as well as past MPO meetings, to provide public comments, in addition to everyone who wrote in with written comments for this week. So taking these in alphabetical order by municipality, beginning with the Minuteman Bikeway in Bedford, which is currently funded by the MPO in 2023. A letter was submitted by Sarah Stanton, the town manager for the town of Bedford. The letter details the town's support for moving the project back into fiscal year 2022 and outlines the reasons the project saw a cost increase during this year's TIP cycle. These reasons include updated culvert designs, adjustments to utilities to minimize environmental impacts, revisions to sidewalk and parking lot designs based on 25% design and design public hearing comments, and finally, unit cost escalation throughout the project. Second, moving now to project number 609204, the Belmont Community Path. MPO staff received 123 comments, all but one of which were in support of the project this week. This project is being considered for funding this year. So these comments come in addition to the comments in opposition to the project that we've heard in recent meetings, which have come primarily from abutters of the proposed project route near the town center of Belmont. The support letters detail a range of benefits for the community path, including enhancing safety for students at the adjacent schools, as well as for people walking and biking more generally. Providing greater multimodal connectivity to local destinations, the town center and public library, as well as regional destinations via the adjoining Fitchburg Cutoff Path and the eventual western connection to the Mass Central Rail Trail. Several commenters also note that these connections will provide new commuting options for those who work in Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston. And finally, the letters detail that the path will support recreational opportunities for neighbors, enhance the environment through the implementation of stormwater upgrades, and through projected reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and a range of other benefits. Collectively, the letters state high levels of support in the town and across the region for funding this project as soon as it's feasible. And you heard some of those comments earlier today. Next, we have 4 letters of support for Everett's Transportation Management Association project, which is being considered for Community Connections funding. Letters were received from the Everett Chamber of Commerce, the Mystic River Watershed Association, the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, and Post Office Corner LLC. Together, these letters outline the support the project would provide to a range of transportation initiatives in the city, including the operation of shuttles, enhancements to bike share and bicycle infrastructure, the use of carpool and vanpool by local workers, and education programs encouraging higher use of existing local shared use path systems for transportation purposes. The letters request that the MPO provide funding for this project in this year's Community Connections Program. Next, we have a letter from Thomas Mayo, the Hingham Town Administrator. Mr. Mayo provides an update on the Route 3A project in Hingham, currently being funded by the MPO in fiscal year 2025. The letter requests that this board consider moving this project up 1 year into fiscal year 2024, as the project is a high priority for the town and is projected for advertisement, to be ready for advertisement before its current 2025 date. We received 2 letters on behalf of the Linfield Street project in Lynn, which you also heard about during today's public comment. And this project is currently programmed in fiscal year 2022. So as was noted earlier today, this project was recommended by MassDOT for a 1-year delay, but recent conversations between the city and state have made progress in addressing some of these issues. To that end, the letters request the project remain as programmed in 2022. Letters were submitted by Thomas McGee, the mayor of Lynn, as well as several state legislators, including Senator Crichton and Representatives Cahill, Capano, Ehrlich, and Wong. In addition to highlighting a desire for the project to remain in 2022, the letters note the strong local support for the project and the many benefits it will bring to the city of Lynn, including enhanced safety for all users and increased mobility for people walking and biking. Next, a letter was submitted by Patricia Zido on behalf of the Salem for All Ages Task Force. Ms. Zido writes in support of MPO funding for the Salem Skipper Microtransit service through the MPO's 2022 Community Connections Program. The letter highlights that this service is currently up and running because of the strong commitment of the city of Salem to the project, even when faced with beginning service during the pandemic. The letter notes the benefits of the project for older adults in particular, supporting increased mobility and access to local destinations for those who may not have many other transportation alternatives. And finally, we received 4 more letters of support for the Swampscott Rail Trail, which again you heard about earlier today. This comes on top of the 6 support letters presented at the last meeting on March 4th. Letters were submitted by State Representative Ehrlich and State Senator Crichton, as well as by town residents Irene and Jonathan Lehman, Greg and Ellen James, and Pete and Maggie Raymond. Collectively, the letters highlight the many benefits the project will provide for the town, including increased access to open space, recreation and schools, creation of new connections between neighbors and neighborhoods locally, and the regional mobility provided by future connections to the Marblehead Rail Trail and Northern Strand Path. Overall, the letters indicate the robust levels of support for the project across the Swampscott community. So I'll also briefly note that MPO staff received numerous additional written comments within the last 48 hours or so, including somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 additional support letters for the Belmont Community Path. Those comments will be compiled and shared in full with this board at the next MPO meeting on March 25th. So be on the lookout for those in the coming days. All right, so with all of that table setting, let's dive into a discussion on this year's TIP projects. In total, we scored 31 projects for funding, with a roughly even split between projects that were scored for the first time and others that have already been scored in previous years. These projects span 5 of the MPO's investment programs, including 7 complete streets projects, 2 intersection improvement projects, 2 bicycle and pedestrian projects, 2 major infrastructure projects, and 17 community connections projects. So we'll discuss these projects by investment program, starting with bicycle network and pedestrian connections. First up is the Swampscott Rail Trail. This project is a 10-foot wide, 2.1 mile long multi-use trail connecting the existing Marblehead Rail Trail to the Swampscott commuter rail station. The trail represents Swampscott's portion of the East Coast Greenway, which is an effort to create a 3,000-mile greenway running from Florida to Maine. The trail will make use of existing railroad abutments to create a bridge over Route 1A. The town will host trail amenities, including parking and bathrooms at the Swampscott Middle School. The project has a total score of 62.4 points. Next is the Belmont Community Path. This project is a 16-foot wide paved path connecting the existing Fitchburg Cutoff Path, which connects to the Alewife Red Line station, to Belmont Center and the Belmont Commuter Rail Station. This project runs adjacent to Belmont High School and the Fitchburg Commuter Rail Line and includes an underpass under the active railroad tracks at Alexander Avenue. This project represents phase 1 of 2 for the Belmont portion of the Mass Central Rail Trail. A second phase of this project is anticipated to connect further west to the MCRT in Waltham. This project has a total score of 59 points. Moving now to complete streets projects. First up is Western Avenue in Lynn. This project will fully reconstruct 1.9 miles of Western Avenue beginning just south of the Lynn-Salem border and heading south towards central Lynn. This project will enhance safety for all users along this high crash corridor through improved design and signal operations and new signs and pavement markings. The project will also add new bike lanes and reconstruct existing sidewalks and ramps to bring them into ADA compliance. Furthermore, the project is exploring transit signal priority to accommodate MBTA bus routes 424, 434, and 450. It will also include the reconstruction of existing bus stops. Western Avenue is the highest scoring major infrastructure project. Oops, sorry, that's an old note here. This project is the highest scoring complete streets project rather, with a score of 71.4 points. Next, we have Park and Pearl Streets in Chelsea. This is a new project for this year, which aims to reconstruct Park and Pearl Streets as complete streets, providing enhanced mobility for all modes, but especially people walking, biking, and taking transit. This project aims to support economic development and improved air quality in downtown Chelsea by improving sidewalks and crosswalks for pedestrian safety and implementing smart signal technology to support the movement of transit and other users. The corridor is also being considered for a future shared bus and bike lane, which would connect to the forthcoming work on nearby Broadway, as you heard mentioned earlier in today's public comment period. And that project is again funded by the MPO in fiscal year 2022. This project has an overall score of 68.9 points. Moving now to the rehabilitation of Washington Street in Brookline. This is another new project for this year, which aims to rehabilitate Washington Street as a true complete streets corridor. This project will add new protected bicycle lanes and support pedestrian safety through the reconstruction of sidewalks and shortening of crossing distances at crosswalks. The project will also support better MBTA bus operations through the relocation and consolidation of stops, the provision of pull-out space at bus stops, and the implementation of transit signal priority. This project has an overall score of 56.9 points. In Salem and Peabody is the Boston Street Improvement Project. This project aims to improve safety at two high crash locations at Bridge Street and Essex Street through the reconstruction of the roadway and the modernization of the corridor signals. The project will create new off-street bicycle facilities that span the length of the corridor, will bring existing sidewalks, ramps, and bus stops into ADA compliance while addressing the existing poor condition of the roadway pavement. This project scores a total of 54.5 points. Next up is the reconstruction of Route 30 in Weston. This project will reconstruct the roadway to create a corridor that better serves all users. This project includes geometric modifications and the modernization of signals to improve traffic flow and safety. The project also includes the construction of a 10-foot shared use path along the 3.7-mile length of the corridor, creating bike facilities where none exist today and improving conditions for pedestrians. Of note, this project aims to connect its multimodal facilities with those being proposed on Route 30 in Newton, a project that was scored last year by the MPO and received funding through statewide federal funds. This project has an overall score of 49.2. Another new project this year is the improvements to County Street in Ipswich, which you also heard a little bit about earlier. This project's key goals include the rehabilitation of a deteriorating stone arch bridge over the Ipswich River, improving conditions for people walking and biking by closing existing gaps in the sidewalk and bike network, and enhancing safety at crossings. The project will bring the corridor into ADA compliance and support better connections to local destinations, including the nearby town center and adjacent river walk and other recreational areas. This project received a total score of 45.4 points. Next up is the reconstruction of Main Street in Wakefield. This project will completely reconstruct Main Street and the surrounding roadways through downtown Wakefield. The project will narrow the existing roadway to include new dedicated bicycle facilities and expanded pedestrian facilities in the form of a new shared use path along South Main Street. Shortened crossings and improved signals will further improve safety at intersections while increasing multimodal connectivity to the MBTA bus routes 136 and 137, the Wakefield commuter rail station, and nearby recreational assets, including the proposed Wakefield-Linfield Rail Trail, which is a MassDOT funded TIP project. This project has a total score of 39.5 points. And finally, for complete streets, we have the Central Street Bridge reconstruction in Manchester by the Sea. This project aims to reconstruct the deteriorating bridge that carries Route 127 over Sawmill Brook in downtown Manchester by the Sea. Though this project will only reconstruct 225 feet of Central Street, this project preserves a key connection to the town center and commuter rail station. This project also prevents future flooding issues by enhancing drainage in the project area and addressing the existing tidal gate under the bridge, which is not currently functional. This project has an overall score of 34.8 points. We have two intersection improvement projects seeking funding this year.
Matt, can I interrupt you for a second?
Absolutely.
Can you go back to the Belmont Path for a second?
Yes, just a sec.
Thanks.
There we go.
Based on a public comment, I think this is the wrong map, right? This shows the bike path actually going to the south of the commuter rail tracks as opposed to staying to the north, or is this the right map? I think this is the map that shows the grade crossing.
Yeah, correct. So this map does need to be updated with the sort of right-hand section of the path moved to the north. The section in the middle where you see the sort of jut up is an underpass that's proposed, but the eastern portion of the path would be north of the rail tracks, and the underpass would connect to the high school.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, we can get this updated in the tip materials. So thank you for pointing that out as part of the public comment period.
Thanks,
Mr. Chair, for clarifying that.
Sorry to interrupt. Go back to your presentation, Matt. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. So first up on intersection improvements is the Route 20 and Wellesley Street intersection in Weston. The project will reconfigure the intersection to consolidate pavement area and simplify turning movements in order to improve safety at this high crash location. The project will install a new traffic signal to reduce congestion and will improve multimodal accommodations by reconstructing existing sidewalks, adding new sidewalks, and constructing bike lanes through the intersection where none exist today. Enhancements will also be made to the school bus stop located adjacent to the intersection. This project has a total score of 45.6 points. And for our other intersection project this year, we have the intersection of Squantum Street and Adams Street in Milton. This project will install a traffic signal at an intersection that is currently unsignalized in an effort to enhance safety and reduce queuing during peak hours along Squantum Street. The reconstruction of existing sidewalks to ADA standards and the addition of bike lanes where none exist today will further enhance multimodal safety and accessibility at the intersection. This project has an overall score of 34.1 points. Last but not least, before I turn it over to Sandy for a bit, is the couple of major infrastructure projects that we're looking at this year. So first is Mcgrath Boulevard in Somerville. This project will greatly enhance connectivity between the neighborhoods in East Somerville by bringing the elevated McCarthy Viaduct down to an at-grade urban boulevard. The reconstructed roadway will include a mix of off-street and protected bicycle facilities, as well as completely rebuilt and widened sidewalks throughout the corridor. The improvements along Mcgrath will connect the extended Somerville Community Path and will improve multimodal access to the forthcoming Green Line extension, which includes new stations at nearby Union Square and East Somerville. Opportunities exist along the project corridor for dedicated bus lanes and queue jumps, and those are currently being explored as part of the project's move towards 25% design. This project has an overall score of 65.8 points. And second on major infrastructure is the Route 9 and 27 Interchange project in Natick. This project involves the complete reconfiguration of the existing interchange and overpass into a modified diverging diamond format. The existing Route 27 bridge over Route 9 was built in 1931 and is listed as structurally deficient and does not include appropriate multimodal accommodations. The modified interchange will include dedicated off-street facilities for pedestrians and cyclists, including a separate bicycle and pedestrian bridge over Route 9 in between two spans that will support vehicular traffic. The enhanced shared use facilities will improve connections to Natick Center and the nearby Cochituate Rail Trail. This project has an overall score of 56.2 points. And like Somerville, the Mcgrath Boulevard project, I'll just note that this project is programmed in the federal fiscal years 2025 through 29 time band in the MPO's long-range transportation plan, making both of these major infrastructure projects active near-term priorities. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Sandy Johnston, for a bit to discuss the community connections projects that we received applications for this year.
All right, thanks, Matt. And I will be quick in the interest of time and get into the important discussions the MPO has on its agenda for today. So before we tackle the new community connections projects, I want to take a moment to go over some of the pre-existing commitments in this program. You'll remember that the pilot round of the community connections program last year funded a number of projects within the pilot year of federal fiscal year 2021, but there were also several carryover projects. One project requested 3 years of funding covering fiscal years 21 through 23. And you'll remember that the MPO agreed to fund, but did not formally program 3 projects in federal fiscal year 2022 at the request of the proponents. We're just going to go over these projects quickly since time is short and you'll be familiar with them from last year. I want to emphasize that these projects are presented here as they applied, unless otherwise noted. In some cases, small details may have changed, especially given the COVID situation over the past year. All scores presented for returning projects are based on the scoring criteria used in the pilot round, which scored projects out of 60, and are thus not directly comparable to those for new projects, which are scored out of 100. The MPO has committed 3 years of funding to the City of Newton, contingent on Newton demonstrating a recurring air quality benefit to operate a microtransit service throughout the city. Federal fiscal year 2022 will be the middle year of those 3. The MPO agreed to commit 3 years of funding beginning in fiscal year 22 to the town of Canton and the Neponset Valley Transportation Management Association to operate shuttles between several MBTA stations and the Royal Street office area off of Route 128 in Canton. The 128 Business Council and the MBTA are partnering to receive funds to implement wayfinding signage and GPS systems for riders on the 128 BC shuttles that operate out of Alewife MBTA station. And finally, 3 municipalities, the MPO is committed to provide funds to 3 municipalities to expand the Blue Bike Spike Share system. You may remember that this project did look somewhat different last year. The format of the financing has changed, and there are now 3 participating municipalities rather than 4. Chelsea has found alternate arrangements for financing their share of the expansion, but the overall cost of the project is the same. All right, and now for the main event, the new Community Connections projects that applied for funding beginning in federal fiscal year 2022. Today's just going to be a quick overview of these projects. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to review the one-pagers on these projects that are posted on the meeting calendar, which have significantly more information. So we'll start out with the bicycle-themed projects. In addition to the multi-municipality Blue Bikes expansion that applied in the pilot round, this year we received a separate application from Medford and Malden to expand the system in their municipalities. The MBTA has requested funds to build new bicycle racks and storage at numerous stations across the transit network. The town of Wellesley requests funds to place bike racks around Wellesley Middle School, which is also proximate to MWRTA service and to MBTA Regional Rail. The town of Acton has requested a small amount of money to modernize parking payment and management at town-controlled lots near the South Acton rail station. Following up on the 2 transit signal priority projects funded in the pilot round, the MBTA has applied for 2 such projects this year on corridors that serve multiple bus routes, on Salem Street in Malden and Main Street in Malden and Everett. We also have several applications from projects that would operate a transit system this year. Specifically, several of these are microtransit, like the existing Newton project, an app-based demand response service serving a defined geographic zone with small vehicles. The City of Salem requests funding to extend operation of its new Salem Skipper microtransit service, as you heard earlier from their comment letter. The Montechusett Regional Transit Authority requests funding to leverage existing vehicles to operate microtransit in a 4-town area in the Magic subregion. And the City of Boston has partnered with a company called Circuit to request funds to operate an electric small vehicle microtransit service in part of the Roxbury and Dorchester neighborhoods. Moving from microtransit projects to fixed route, the town of Watertown and its TMA, as you heard from Sophia earlier, have applied to create a shuttle service along a rapidly developing stretch with limited MBTA service. Just so that you know, this project did apply last year. They had some financing arrangements and that fell through and did not launch their service over the past year like they were planning, so they're coming back to the MPO this year. The town of Stowe has applied for fixed route funding for a commute-oriented shuttle to the South Acton train station. The town of Brookline and their TRIPS program have applied for funding to deliver travel training, such as on how to use travel apps to seniors. Though housed in Brookline, these trainings would be carried out all over the Boston region if funded. Finally, the City of Everett has requested funding to aid in establishing a Transportation Management Association, or TMA, that would cover the city but have potential to expand to cover neighboring areas as well. There are a couple of items to note about this application. First, establishing a TMA is not one of the uses for the Community Connection program that previous MPO conversations, when the board was working with staff to develop the program, have envisioned. That does not mean you should not choose to fund the project, but it might be something you wish to discuss. Secondly, this project has not yet passed the Commonwealth CMAQ Consultation Committee, where it would be required to demonstrate an air quality benefit. If it does not pass that committee, it will be ineligible for inclusion in the Community Connections Program. The project proponent is aware of both of those items. So I am now going to hand it back to Matt to finish up and set up the important discussions in front of the MPO today.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandy. So with that, let's dive into the last major portion of this presentation, which is a discussion of 3 draft programming scenarios for this year's TIP. So MPO staff approached scenario development for this week's meeting by asking one essential question, which is how can the MPO proactively consider more of its goals when making project funding decisions, rather than maintaining a focus largely on project readiness and cost, which have been the major drivers of programming conversations in recent meetings. While project readiness and cost are certainly important and things that have to be taken into account when programming projects, the MPO has also spent years crafting the goals and objectives outlined in its current long-range transportation plan. These goals fall into the 6 categories that you all are familiar with, including equity, safety, system preservation, capacity management, clean air, and economic vitality. So from this question and from the conversation had at the MPO's meeting on scenario 1 on March 4th, MPO staff developed 3 new scenarios for consideration this week, each centered around a different thematic approach to making programming decisions. These themes include maintaining current MPO practice when making TIP programming decisions. This practice largely takes the approach of fully accommodating any cost or readiness issues for currently programmed projects before considering new projects for funding with whatever resources remain available. Scenario number 3 is centered around equity, asking how the MPO can more equitably distribute its funds in the region to people of color, low-income households, people with limited English proficiency, people with disabilities, older adults, and youth. And finally, scenario number 4 prioritizes funding projects that advance progress on the MPO's performance measures, specifically seeking to more fully address high crash locations and greenhouse gas emissions through project selection. Again, these scenarios are available for review on the MPO's website, along with a guide detailing the approach taken when crafting each of them. So I encourage you to pull that up and have it for reference if you don't already, but I will run through them now individually here in just a minute. So in crafting each of these scenarios, there were a handful of universal assumptions made by MPO staff. Every scenario reflects updated cost and readiness information for every project as of earlier this week on March 16th. Each scenario assumes the MPO will maintain its existing commitments to Community Connections Program at $2 million in each fiscal year, and its Transit Modernization Program at $5.5 million annually beginning in 2025. Each scenario still centers project readiness and cost in decision-making, as these 2 elements largely establish the baseline for what's possible in any given, for any given project in any given fiscal year. And every scenario shows a large funding surplus in fiscal year 2022 that has been created by readiness issues for 5 of the 10 projects currently programmed in that year in 2022. To deal with this, every scenario proposes funding all of the new Community Connections projects in fiscal year 2022, in addition to other possible solutions, which we'll come to in just a minute. Beginning with scenario number 2, the general approach taken here by MPO staff is the approach that has been taken by this board in years past. The scenario maintains the MPO's existing commitments to all projects, regardless of cost or readiness issues. The scenario results in no projects being removed from the TIP and holds off on adding any new projects until more feedback is provided by this board on how it would like to allocate its funds this year. That leaves a funding surplus of $33.3 million, which is split between fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2026. Central advantage of this approach is that it continues the MPO's historical practice of aiming to provide funding certainty for project proponents. Many concerns have been expressed by this board in the past about rescinding capital funding for a project after a municipality has invested significant time and money in project design and development. The scenario continues to avoid this situation by funding all projects in the TIP as early as possible, within the limitations of project readiness and annual fiscal constraint. The chief drawback of this approach, however, is that it fails to meaningfully consider the funding of new projects within the context of the existing TIP. In other words, this approach assumes that currently funded projects should be prioritized over prospective projects, even when those prospective projects may have a higher evaluation score, be further along in project development, be more affordable, or better address any of the MPO's other goals as discussed earlier. This means that prospective TIP projects are really only considered relative to each other and not to other projects already programmed, even though both current and prospective projects are effectively vying for the same overall pool of funding. Scenario number 3 questions this approach, seeking to instead prioritize projects that deliver funding to communities in the region with large equity populations, whether these projects are currently funded or not. The scenario specifically seeks to address funding disparities present in scenario 2, which are the largest for minority and low-income populations. To do this, the scenario removes 3 currently funded projects from the TIP, focusing on projects that have had large cost increases and are in the outer years of the TIP, and that have few people of color and low-income households within their respective project areas. These projects are replaced with 3 prospective TIP projects that are proximate to large equity populations, contributing all newly available outer year funding to these projects. The scenario also proposes allocating the $19 million funding surplus in fiscal 2022 to the MPO's Transit Modernization Program. Though not including in the funding analysis, because these funds haven't been allocated to specific projects, it is assumed that these funds would primarily benefit minority and low-income people if it were spent on bus or rapid transit improvements in the region. The key advantage of this scenario is that it helps to reduce existing and projected disparities in the distribution of MPO funds to equity populations in the region. The key drawback, however, is that we know proximity does not equal benefit, meaning that just because funding is spent in a certain place does not necessarily mean the project inherently delivers the benefits needed by the surrounding equity populations. This issue has been addressed in the new TIP project scoring criteria, but time limitations prevented staff from conducting a more thorough essential nexus analysis of both people and project benefits for all currently programmed projects. If this type of analysis is of interest to the board, MPO staff could come back with more analysis on this front at a later date. And finally, our 4th and final scenario, staff took the same approaches in scenario 3, but replaced equity considerations with prioritizing projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address high crash locations in the region. The scenario results in 2 projects being defunded, with 2 new projects added in their place that address these issues more directly. The scenario largely allocates all available funding in the outer years of the TIP, but leaves available the $19 million in funding in fiscal 2022 for use on another project or set of projects. The main advantage of this approach is that it fully considers all projects as peers, regardless of programming status, prioritizing projects that allow the MPO to more meaningfully address its safety and climate goals. The main limitation to this approach, however, is that it only considers 2 performance metrics, the data availability for which may be somewhat limited. This is especially true for currently programmed projects, as MPO staff do not necessarily receive up-to-date information on program projects as they advance in design. That means when a program project adds elements that may improve its ability to do something like reduce greenhouse gas emissions, these changes are not reflected in that project score, which we could then utilize when comparing it to peer projects in later decisions. There are certainly plenty of lessons to be learned from each of these approaches, but I'd like to focus on 3 of those here. First, every approach inherently contains trade-offs, many of which are difficult ones. Prioritizing one goal or set of goals over another will necessarily create winners and losers in an environment where available funding is dwarfed by project demands. Second, though the MPO has historically taken the approach of funding existing commitments first, there are many other lenses through which funding decisions can be considered. These lenses can include equity and performance goals, like addressing high crash locations or greenhouse gas emissions, the topics that we discussed today. But these lenses can also include virtually any other aspect of the projects vying for funding, from the improvements they provide to transit operations to the extent to which they provide multimodal connections to jobs and services. These elements are all considered to a certain extent in the TIP project evaluation score, but this board has historically not compared scores for prospective TIP projects to scores for existing projects to make funding decisions. And finally, there are certainly data and time limitations that dictated what was possible to bring to today's conversation. That being said, if there are elements of these analyses that are compelling to this board, staff could better plan in future years to bring these into the conversation earlier in the TIP cycle. Winding down here, coming back to our goals for today, this board needs to build consensus on an approach to a scenario or scenarios for next week's meeting, at which point this body will need to approve a draft TIP program. There's also room for discussion today on MPO policy changes for cost increases and other programming issues. And again, this can take the form of both short-term and long-term considerations. And bringing back our policy questions from earlier today as well, this board should discuss whether policy changes are warranted, again, on the short or long term, for projects that see significant cost changes. This board should also discuss if there's an appetite to create fiscal room in the TIP for more projects, and if so, by what metrics these decisions should be made. Before we discuss those, I'll briefly highlight where we're heading. At the next MPO meeting on March 25th, we will discuss final draft scenarios with the intention of arriving at a draft 5-year plan by the end of the meeting. This plan will then be released for a 21-day public review period in late April, followed by a final endorsement vote in late May. And that's all I have. Thank you for bearing with us through a lot of content today, but Sandy and I are both available if there are questions on any of the projects or to support any other conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I see some members have comments they'd like to make. Jay Monty.
Great, thank you, Matt. Just a question, in the two scenarios where you're proposing potentially removing 2 projects, adding 2 others, just curious how you chose the 2 to be removed and how you chose the 2 to be added, and just who the proponents were for each of those projects. I know oftentimes the proponent is not always the city or town; it might be MassDOT or an agency. Just give me a little more background on how you came to those projects.
Yes, you're referencing scenario number 4, correct?
I think both 3 and 4, right?
Both 3, yeah. Yeah, there are project removals in both. Yeah, so our starting point for looking at projects to potentially, delay or remove really started with, sort of an overview analysis of the cost increase problems. I mean, as you'll see in the each of the scenario tables posted today, we've added a column that's second from the right that notes the cost change for any given project since it was first programmed. And so, we use that number along with, cost increases for this year to say, like, which projects are, sort of increasing in costs and potentially, getting further away from their, intentionally programmed amount when the MPO made that first decision. So there are a number of those projects that fit into that category, unfortunately. And so from there, in the equity scenario, staff said, basically how much money do we need to free up in order to move the needle on decreasing the disparities in funding allocations across populations in the region. And so we looked at projects that were in the running for consideration this year and said, which of these really make an impact on that metric or on those metrics, and then said, from there, how much funding would we, again, essentially need to remove from the TIP and allocate to those new projects. Yeah, so sort of a combination of several factors, but the overall goal is to get to a place in scenario 3 that move the needle on equity, and then in scenario 4, the approach was essentially the same, but the goal was to bump up the number of high crash locations that were addressed, and so we know we have some prospective TIP projects that do a really great job of doing that work. The same with greenhouse gas emissions, and so that drove some of the thinking around which projects to remove. Some projects actually have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions projected from their work. And so, so projects like that are obvious candidates in that case to move out. So a little bit project by project, but, the overarching sort of goal is the same for all scenarios.
So I'm guessing the proponents of the projects that are shown as possible removals have not been notified other than if they've seen this today. Is that right?
So all project proponents have been kept in the loop on all MPO meetings this spring. And so, it's sort of up to proponents to stay in touch with this. I mean, they've received all the materials. And so, that's something that, I can't personally call sort of every proponent every week.
No, but I mean, for the 3 or 4 projects that you're showing as potential to be removed, did they get a heads up before you showing the the document today, or is this the first they'll have seen it?
Well, so in some of the cases, I mean, some of the proponents here are MassDOT-led design projects. And so, that sort of changes the game. I mean, obviously the municipalities have a stake in any project that's happening within their borders. But, in the case of a few of these, MassDOT is the lead proponent. And so, yeah. So the short answer to your question is individual emails were not sent out to each of these towns, but everyone was informed of the general sort of,
But I guess to your point, I mean, some of these are MassDOT projects, or the proponent is MassDOT, so MassDOT is presumably at least open to this somewhat.
Yeah, and I guess I'll emphasize here that these scenarios are meant to be illustrative more than necessarily very specific recommendations, and so the goal is to sort of think through if we wanted to make decisions like this, would we make decisions that look like what is here today? Would we change those decisions? So we're sort of leaning on you all as staff to the board to say what are your priorities, and if looking at something like this makes you say like this, this is not a comfortable solution for me, then we'd obviously like to hear that. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Matt. Again, I just want to kind of take the temperature of everybody who's affected before we, were to make a decision one way or the other. Thank you.
David Gozes.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, staff. So I think we need to be very, very careful now when we vote to add a new project onto the TIP for the first time, especially after all the conversations we've been having about cost overruns. Maybe for the community connections, we could think about this a little differently because for those projects, as far as I know, the costs are pretty much capped. But I just think we should be more conservative because, when a project is programmed for the first time, we're pretty much, or we like to think that we're committing to that project, and we're giving our blessing to that proponent to go and spend money on design. And I think that that's a critical point, that we are saying, yes, we think that this is a good project. We're committing to it. Now you can go and spend your resources on the design where they might not otherwise do that. So I think before we commit to a project, we really should have a complete understanding of that project, maybe more than some of us do now. The cost, what might be included in that cost, what might not be included, what possible changes might happen to that project. What else? Who's paying for the design? What kind of expansion might happen with this project? We all get, a lot of pressure to program projects. People want their projects programmed. I definitely get that, right? And there's a lot of great projects, but I think that the last thing that we should be doing is to say to someone, yes, we're going to program this project. We're actively encouraging them now to go and spend their money on the design. And then later on, we might be in this position. I think that would be the worst thing to do, to remove a project because either their project had cost overruns or some other project. So that's where I am.
Thank you, David. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Matt, for the presentation and the details about the scenarios. I want to say that I am happy to see that the Bedford Minuteman Bikeway Extension project in all of these scenarios we're looking at is being moved forward to 2022. As they've stated, they are, in ahead of schedule, and the MassDOT agrees with that. So I'm glad to see that. I'm certainly in support of keeping funding for the Community Connections program as well. I think I'm a little bit unclear about. I understand that there's, I guess, enough funding to cover all of the projects, but a little bit unclear is whether or not that sort of the recommended proposal is to fund all of the projects, assuming that they're all viable. So that's one question. And I was a little confused about the scenarios because I think you broke out all of the projects in the scenarios 3 and 4, but not in scenario 2. And it seemed like most of the funding was for community connections was front loaded into FY22 in that scenario 2. So I just a little bit confused about that. If you can explain it. And then just to follow up on what Jay was saying, Jay Monty, about the projects that were proposed to be removed, I think I was surprised. Well, when you look at the 2 scenarios for 3 and 4, 2 of the projects are like the I guess it was Milford and Wilmington are, they're both illustratively could be removed, and I was similarly sort of wondering why those 2 in particular seem to fall out of both the equity and the performance scenarios. So I might be interested in drilling down a little bit more on that, but I know you already answered. I know you already answered Jay, and I don't know if there's anything more to say about that. So I have other comments, but I'll yield my time for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Matt, anything you need to say to those comments?
Yeah, I can address just clarify what's going on with the community connections. So actually in all 3 scenarios, the amount of funding allocated to the program as a whole is the same. In scenario 2, everything is just shown sort of like, bundled into one line, and it says we could allocate, up to $3.7 million, and that would cover all the projects. So the same amount of funding is shown there. It's just not broken out by project. And then we, showed those projects in the other scenarios. Because those are the scenarios where we actually chose to formally add new projects to show, what could be the makings of a recommendation. And so the reason, we just didn't do that in scenario 2 is because we wanted to leave it sort of, as a baseline, set of conditions, and then we can move from there on, programming specific projects. And one of the reasons we made the recommendation, a couple of times to fund all of the community connections projects is because, as was just noted earlier, these are sort of like, defined contribution projects. Like proponents get exactly what they get, when we do the tip. And, if we're in a situation this year where we can't fund very many new other projects, then this puts us in a position to, be able to at least distribute some funding around the region to several different projects and move those forward, even if we can't add, a lot of new stuff in the 5th and final year. So that was sort of the logic there. But I'll stop there.
Thanks. Brian? Kane?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you, Matt and Sandy and everybody for these scenarios. I know they're illustrative and they're really helpful to sort of spell out what can and can't happen. For my fellow board members, I think we've really put staff in kind of a bad position here. We're sort of asking them to read our minds and tell us exactly what we want to know without giving a heck of a lot of direction. So I'm going to try and at least for myself, be sort of clear on what my thinking is, so that we can sort of, we got to make a decision really soon on this. I think municipalities have sort of been playing by the rules that are already established when they've submitted projects for the current tip, from 22 to 26 at least. A lot of cases, they have squirreled away their Chapter 90 funds or used their own CIP funds, which is, there's not a lot of that around these days. So I'm not really comfortable sort of moving the goalposts now, at least, through 26. So for that reason, I think I'm in support of scenario 2 at the moment, but I do think we do need to make some changes going forward. And so what I would suggest, and I guess, David, this might be to you or to the rest of the board. I think we need to establish some kind of a committee to take this, really work with staff, come back and make a full-throated recommendation to the rest of the MPO on a policy-driven approach going forward for 27 going out that can look at whether it's an equity lens or a greenhouse gas lens or a lens of leaving some money around or fixed amount funding or whatever. These are all good ideas that have been knocking around, but I think we need somebody, some group to sort of take it and run with it. And so, my suggestion is that we sort of maintain the status quo through 26, because cities and towns have been, working towards that. And then starting in 27 or whenever the next one is, we begin making those policy changes. And I do think that this is just too big of a body to sort of have these discussions at this level of specificity, and it needs to go to a smaller group that can sort of dedicate the time and work with the staff to come back and make those sort of recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Lynn?
It's a pleasure going after you, Mr. King, because it saves me a lot of words. And I really agree with just about everything you said. So with that said, I have a couple of questions, and you could give very short answers, Matt, and then a little extension on some other thoughts of mine. So on that Chelsea project that came down in cost, am I right in that the cost overrun went from over 3 million to it was reduced by 2 million?
Yeah, so sorry, let me just pull up the number here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was roughly a $1.5 or $2 million reduction in the original projected cost increase, which I believe was in the neighborhood of 3 million. So I think roughly half to 2/3 of the projected cost increases were pulled back out. I know the city was working with their designers to sort of address issues for the cost overrun and tried to bring that number back down. And so I think that's where we saw the initial jump up, and then the sort of ending back more towards the project's baseline.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand what was why was there a discrepancy?
Well, so I think there was a projected cost increase a couple of months ago, sort of earlier in the tip cycle. And then in the intervening time, the city was working with their consultant, their project manager, et cetera, to try to address some of those, projected increases and say, like, how can we bring this cost back down? That's my understanding of what happened. And so I think, between that initial jump that happened in something like earlier mid-January, there's since been another update to the project costs based on those further conversations, and it allowed the cost to come back down.
Yeah, I just don't have an explanation though. I have a description of what happened, just not why. So I just at this point have no confidence, really, without understanding why there was a difference. Whether I should believe this number versus the other number. Because really, what I was getting at was trying to understand why there was a discrepancy, to get a sense of whether those reasons could apply to other cost increases that we see. But I'm not going to press it, because I don't think I'm going to get more of an answer. But maybe I can get that later on. So the next question I have is on the community connection scores. Is a breakdown of those scores available?
Yeah, I can provide that
Okay.
privately, or if the board is interested, we can present it in more detail at a later
Sure.
date.
Great. That's an easy yes. And I'll say that it would definitely be good to get a more on the equity analysis. When you were describing the scenario that focused on equity, it would be good to get more of that. I realize that you didn't have much time on this. It might be something that we will discuss doing later. If you have time in this cycle, or just later on based on what we decide to do as a board with respect to future policy. I did find it curious, that the performance metrics aren't updated once the projects are programmed. I guess, on some level I should have known that, but I think that will affect how we look at policy going on. Because if we program something, in the 5th year, and as it progresses, its impact on various metrics change, then it would be good for us to be able to factor that in. And Matt had said that sometimes things change in the program, the project design or whatever, that has impact. And so I'm kind of curious about how that design changes, So now that's going to lead to my comment, and I want to thank Matt through Peterson from Transit Matters, who attended the last RTAC meeting. He sent a letter because I encouraged people to give us some ideas about how they felt about this. And one of his thoughts, it was a very good letter. I hope that he will submit it to the board. But one element of it was how we do the project design. And the suggestion was that the MPO or maybe some other entity should take on that project design. So maybe early on, we decide which projects we want to take on, and that would be based on any number of metrics. And at that point, I think then we would have the ability, if things change, to then say, well, we're going to kill this project, because at that point the municipality hasn't paid for the design, and we'd have to be careful, because once again people do start making plans on things, but once I'll stop here with that, because that can become part of the policy discussion that we can have later on, whether we have the subcommittee or not. But I just want to toss that out there. And I also wanted to toss out the notion, and we've talked about this before, of a cost benefit analysis, because I could, when I'm looking at the numbers, when Matt went through the projects, I was doing like, okay, if I divide the score by the cost of the project, I get some kind of metric there. And if I had a breakdown, and we do have the breakdown of the scores for the separate metrics, we can develop our own weighting for that, and have some sense of whether these projects how they measure up against each other in another set of metrics. So I spewed out a lot. I'll stop for now. Thanks for listening.
I'm going to let Ben Cares from Chelsea speak, because I think he might be answering Lynn's question about the differing cost estimates for Chelsea's project and how trustworthy they are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dickens. I appreciate sort of your observation of that cost reduction. And yeah, there were a couple of things that we moved through in terms of coordination with our design team that did benefit the overall cost estimate. Obviously, inflation is something that all of these cost increases are suffering from, and that was predominantly due to some addition to some side street limits for specifically our intersection reconstruction, which we were able to taper back some of those project scope areas, as well as some inflation within the drainage design. And then we also were able to do some utility investigation with our ongoing Department of Public Works utility reconstruction project along Upper Broadway. So that definitely parsed out some conditions and elements of the project that we could better approach strategies for the utility rehabilitation, or whether it was sort of lining in place. So there were some cost realizations there. And in addition to that, we were able to witness some of the underground geotechnical and soil compositions, which did inform some cost increases to our hazmat and sort of approach to the unsuitable soil situation within the roadway. It's sort of a rich historical area, so there's also some railroad ties, just some volatility in that pricing as we sort of unearth those things. We did benefit from the drainage program. So if you can do your drainage program well before surface reconstruction, you can get a better sort of cost estimate, which would otherwise parse out in some type of significant change order, probably at construction. So that was beneficial. Additionally, we had some discrepancies with our traffic signalization estimations. Those were a magnitude of difference, which was a pretty glaring kind of issue between our cost estimates, but we did reconcile that, and that was extremely beneficial. That was about $900K worth of savings. And then we also took another look at some of our non-participating costs, and just overall took a fine-tooth comb to the design, which is much more easily done at 75% estimates, because we have a better idea of sort of what we're dealing with in terms of the project elements themselves between a 25% and 75%. So if that's better for clarity on the board's end, and if it bestows any sort of strategy for the other projects, I hope that is beneficial. So thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Scott, I see you have your hand up. Is that because you need to answer something Lynn brought up?
Yes, please. I would like to address that if I can. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Matt noted, we were kind of, with the performance scenario, we were trying to leverage for this exercise, for this upcoming meeting, the information that we had available. I do want to reassure you that when we produce chapter 4 of the TIP, which is kind of that performance analysis chapter, that analysis is typically done after the MPO has selected their projects, and we use that time in terms of documenting information for the TIP, to check in with some of the project managers at MassDOT just to make sure that we're collecting updated information. So I wanted to be upfront when describing the performance scenario that we did not have the updated data that we would like, but this is information that we would collect as part of a post analysis for this year and in future years, build in time to the process to do kind of a more thorough checkup on the existing projects and their features. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thatcher Keyser.
Yes, thanks. I just want to share, I guess, my thoughts on the discussion of trying to solve the problem as you know, what's the best scenario. And when trying to solve complex problems, I like to try to simplify as much as possible to, I guess, come up with a theory of an approach. And so I look at these scenarios falling into two categories. One is a quantitative category, and the other is a qualitative category. So the quantitative is, you know, maximizing the dollars that we have to get projects done. And the qualitative are meeting, you know, those objectives, specifically the equity and the environmental objectives that are in the other scenarios. So, you know, which is the better way to go? And my sense is our overall goal should be trying to maximize the dollars that we have to get as many projects through the pipeline as possible, and not to waste dollars. And I include the municipal dollars in the calculation, as some previous speakers mentioned, that there are investments made at the local level. I'm going to guess at MassDOT too, that are done that are not necessarily on the sheets on the MPO numbers. So we need to maximize, you know, count those dollars also. So it's maximizing that. And if we're able to maximize sort of the quantitative approach, the use of the dollars for projects, that gives more opportunity to achieve the qualitative side of it, the equity and the environmental. If we go in the other direction, we may try to maximize those, but we may leave dollars on the table and have less projects done, and therefore less equity and environmental projects. So my overall sense is, you know, my preference is scenario number 2, and agree with previous speakers in the sense that let's try to maximize the dollars for projects that we have. But I also agree that it's critically important that as we evaluate new projects coming in, that we put the qualitative aspects as the priorities, but we're trying to maximize the dollars first. So that's my thought process on this discussion, and hope it's helpful.
Thank you. Tom O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'd like to echo Thatcher and in particular what Brian Kane had to say. I do think that we need to be careful about making any changes to the rules at this stage of the game out of fairness to projects that have been we've been committed to for quite some time. But I also do believe that these are things we need to deal with going forward, and we really need to take a hard look at how we deal with these things going forward. But I don't think we should be doing it in midstream at this point. So thank you.
Thank you. Eric Barassa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I also support having a discussion after this TIP cycle, whether that's part of a committee or the full MPO, or led by obviously led by staff, but really delving into how we come up with a policy to deal with cost overruns. Right now, it would feel a little arbitrary to kick people off. I think if we could develop a policy, I even think that having a public comment as part of that would be important. We can, what that looks like, I think we can discuss. I do have a specific question though for Matt. Matt, the Rutherford Avenue project, is it now determined that that project is not ready for 2022? Is there still a question about that, or really is that now a determination that it needs to be pushed back?
Yeah, so at this stage, the recommendation from MassDOT's Highway Division is that the project will not be ready for 2022 advertisement, so it needs to be moved to 2023.
Okay, because that's obviously, I feel like that is different from the last time we met, and that's the big difference from scenario 1 has it still in 2022, right? So really scenario 1 is not appropriate any longer. We now have to look at sort of scenario 2 as like our kind of status quo, I guess what you'd consider to be our keep everyone on the tip status quo project, but now that leaves about a $19 million gap in 2022.
Yeah, that's correct. Scenario 2 is effectively sort of our new baseline that we'll be working from, in terms of, where projects are at on cost and readiness. And so, yeah, that's like the most up-to-date thing that we'll be carrying forward into next meeting as well.
Okay, thank you.
Matt, is that gap solely attributable to the delay of Rutherford by a year?
So it's a great question. And yeah, so there are 5 projects that are currently programmed in 2022 that are not shown as programmed in 2022 in scenario number 2. And so as was discussed earlier in the meeting, there may be a potential to move one of those projects, the Linfield Street project, back up into 2022. But it sounds like at this stage, the other 4 are not going to be ready for 2022. Yeah, and so, we moved, showed the Minuteman and Bedford moved back up to fill some of that gap. But yeah, unfortunately, moving that many projects out, especially larger projects, just created the gap.
And one last question with respect to Rutherford. I know there was some discussion at our last meeting about additional funds that the city might have access to vis-a-vis developer mitigation. Is that now added into the project?
Yeah, so what's shown in the scenarios is that if you look towards the right-hand side of the table, there's a figure listed in sort of other funds being supplied to the project. And so that isn't directly sort of, visible in the year-by-year funding situation, in 23 through 26. But where it is visible is sort of the, the overall dollar amount left that we would have to fund for the project into 2027. And so that, up to 25 million from the city would be taken off that overall project total.
Okay, thank you.
Tom Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to state that I agree with the comments earlier by David Kostas and Brian Kane, and now just recently Eric, about as far as I know, Somerville, as long as I've been on the MPO, is always committed to has always supported projects that once we've committed to, and we're continuing to do that. Even though when I saw scenario 3, I was pleasantly surprised to see Mcgrath Highway in there. But even with that, I still, the mayor has reaffirmed this with me also, that we strongly feel that once we have committed to projects, that we should follow through on that commitment. And I also agree that, I think, policy and process really needs to be set up before we're going to go back and add or remove projects. So I agree with the comments that now's not the time to do that. Once we get through this process, I think we need to move forward on, how we're going to deal with this so that everyone that's involved understands, what the impact is going to be with increasing costs, and how important it's going to be is to try to get these costs right when we're making those decisions. So that kind of leaves me where, scenario 2 seems to be, the scenario that we would support. So thank you.
Thank you. Other comments from the members? Seeing none, Oh, wait, Eric?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to make one additional just point in this conversation about cost overruns is I do think that, and you know, we can talk more about this as we get into talking about a policy for cost overruns, but Brian made a point that, you know, we should hold all projects sort of harmless up until 26. So I would actually disagree with that. And I would say after we develop this policy, the critical thing is to really give a clear guidance, or not guidance, but clear awareness to our cities and towns that this is now our policy moving forward. And so if there are projects that are programmed, you know, in 2023 and 24, that policy then is brought to bear on those projects. If they go up in cost again, they will be reevaluated, and then we would have a rational, you know, system set up for why we make changes. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you, Eric. Any other comments from MPO members at this time? Seeing none, Matthew Peterson, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Hello, I'm Matthew Peterson. I'm Representative Transit Matters. I wanted to thank the board and their staff for their thoughtful questions and staff for their thoughtful work. I believe a robust and transparent process for funding approval and cost change approval would be extremely beneficial for both project proponents and the MPO. I also want to thank Len Diggins for bringing up my comment about increased CTPS capacity to perform project evaluation, management, and design work. I believe that the MPO would be well served by advocating for improved CTPS and institutional capacity, however that can be achieved. One thing I wanted to raise is related to what Len Diggins brought up with respect to the Chelsea cost decrease. It's unclear to me as a member of the public why any member of the MPO should have any lack of information about the causes of cost increase or decrease. And this is not a knock on Len, it's a knock on the lack of transparency for projects that go through this process. Project being funded by the MPO or applying for funding through the MPO should be transparent and clear with our cost structure to both the MPO and the public. And cost changes should, I think, be transparent in the same way. The MPO, I think, needs and deserves a CTPS with the capacity to evaluate project risks and estimate project risks independent of project proponents so that the MPO can make informed decisions about project conclusion and project funding. There are different kinds of cost increases, and I think that improved MPO capacity to evaluate projects transparently would enable this body to make better, more informed, and more equitable decisions. Finally, I encourage the board to direct CTPS to engage with project proponents to search for ways to reduce costs, as with Chelsea, especially for projects that are not as far along the design process. I don't think that we should be cutting too many projects that have already been committed to, but I do think that there are probably opportunities for cost reductions and economizations. I have to stress this is not from a concern about spending too much, it's from a concern about not getting enough. We receive a limited amount of money from the federal government every year, and cost overruns endanger the ability of this body to deliver on much needed transportation improvements. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and thank you for all the hard work you do.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions at this time from the MPO members or the public? So Matt, I think there's, I can count as good as the next guy. Can you put scenario 2 up or explain scenario 2? What's in, what's out, what's not in?
Absolutely. So scenario 2, sort of the major moving pieces is that all, cool, just make sure I'm not on mute. All currently programmed projects remain funded. You know, there is a decent amount of projects moving around due to, you know, fiscal limitations in any given year, but everything that's currently in the 5-year plan will be in the next 5-year plan, minus the projects that are going to advertisement. And so where that leaves us is with this large gap, you know, right now it's shown as roughly $19.5 million in 2022, which would be the first year of the forthcoming TIP. As we talked about a little bit today, there may be an opportunity to move one project back up, but even if that happens, we still have a gap of roughly $13 million in the first year of the TIP that we would need to find a way to address. And then that leaves us with another roughly $13 million, I believe, in, or actually a little bit more, it would be like $19 million in the outer years of the TIP, primarily in 2026, as things sort of shift back up. So, you know, this board, you know, can sort of provide guidance on whether or not they would like to see any new projects funded with especially those outer year funds. You know, that's something that I know we've had sort of both dialogue on both, whether, you know, we should leave a decent amount of funding open and uncommitted, or if we should, you know, try to go ahead and commit most of our funding. And so I think those are the two major decision points going forward, is how to address the 2022 costs or 2022 funding surplus and the 2026 remaining funds.
Comments from MPO members? Brian Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much is the total request for the transit modernization program, Matt?
So we have $5.5 million in the scenario shown in 2025 and 2026 for that program, which is the sort of anticipated rollout of that program that the board signed on to with the most recent long range plan. But the equity scenario 3, proposes potentially using any first year funding, so the 2022 funding surplus, potentially finding a transit project or projects to allocate those funds to. But we, this gap is a newly identified issue, and so we sort of have to act quickly on how we want to address that. Or we could, this board could obviously opt to leave those funds uncommitted for now and then seek options for that going forward.
I mean, I guess I would just suggest that if there is 13 million in 22 that needs to be programmed, the T can find it working with cities and towns to do all kinds of things that will help lots and lots of people. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a curiosity question. For showing for 2021, the Sumner Tunnel and then Woburn, the bridge replacement, those are still showing as, well, at least they're still flagged as high risk. I'm just curious but they haven't been proposed to move around at all. So I'm just curious if there's any more information about the riskiness of those, or we'll just sort of move ahead and keep those where they are. I'm just sort of curious about that, if there's anything more to say about those.
Matt, do you have anything to say, or should I call on John Bouchard?
I can defer to John on the details, but I'll just say for starters that the sort of color coding and nomenclature in the scenario is to indicate MassDOT's initial recommendations for this year based on the Readiness Days conversations in mid-February. And so we've carried that forward, but it's fully possible that the status of those projects may have changed. They become more or less risky. So I can defer to John Bouchard if you'd like to add more to that.
John, can you answer the question about why Woburn and Sumner were originally identified as high risk and whether they're still high risk?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Matt, anytime I can support you and help, I would be happy to do it because you do a tremendous job laying all these scenarios out. I think Sumner, we were looking at a couple different scenarios for Sumner, and that project is actually right now out for letters of interest for a design build project. So it is ready, and the project will be bid after we're able to. We got shortlist. We got firms submitting technical letters of interest, and then we'll be advertising the project as part in this fiscal year. So it was flagged as high risk because we were trying to assess a closure of the tunnel in line with the work that needs to be completed, and that was not 100% known at the time of Readiness Days in February. And for the Woburn project, it's still high risk. Since there are some items that they're working, the city and MassDOT are working through MEPA on the project, and there's some changes in the design of the bridge, some geotechnical work that's being done, but we still feel that it's deliverable in 21.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Other questions from MPO members? Or comments? Tom Ben.
Thank you. Now I'm going to put my 2 cents in for Mcgrath. If there is funding available now that the MassDOT is advancing the design of Mcgrath, we would be, obviously amenable to, having funding going towards Mcgrath if there's, additional funding that's left over because of the scenario 2 situation in later years. Thanks.
Other comments or questions from MPO members? Eric DeRosa.
So I'm gonna actually, as much as I support the Mcgrath project and really love Tom and the mayor, I'm actually gonna say I think before we should program more projects in 26, I actually would support leaving whatever remaining funds unprogrammed and actually working on developing this policy first around cost overruns before we start programming more projects there, especially because it is so far out. I really think we should focus on how do we fill this near-term gap in 2022. If the MBTA is able to bring projects forward and MassDOT, we obviously need to look at that, all options. It is frustrating, that we've seen the Rutherford project pushed back multiple times now, leaving, large gaps that we kind of have to then scramble to figure out what can go in there because of project readiness. And this really goes to the heart of, this issue around cost overruns. And as David noted, it's not just Rutherford. There are other projects too that are causing that hole. But I do think we should focus on that and trying to, find, really good projects that are, ready, that can go into that near-term spot.
Thank you, Eric. Tom Katzis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just something that Eric said, he talked about leaving some money unprogrammed. For this time around, I'm not saying that's a bad idea. It might be a good idea. I just log in that going forward, as far as a permanent solution to these cost issues, I personally, from my observation of the MPO, I personally think that having that as a policy is leaving a set aside of untapped money is not realistic, Mr. Chair, because of the incredible political pressure that we would be pouring upon you as well as the MPO. But with that being said, it might be a good idea, like Eric's saying, for the short term. I just wanted to say that because what that's doing is it's not really addressing the issue that we have in the long term, which is somehow putting another step in there to get the MassDOT expertise in on it, so we get these cost adjustments or some system. But there has been some ideas about setting money aside. I think it might make sense in the short term, but going forward, I think the MPO would fold after. It just would. It's tough to do. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tom. Other MPO members? Seeing none, Rich Benevento.
Thank you, Chairman Moeller. I'm a regular sitting in on the MPO meetings, and of course the deliberations and of course the decisions, obviously of paramount importance and certainly not very easy. And we heard Thatcher mention, qualitative and quantitative of getting to decisions, and we keep hearing about cost overruns and how we address those sorts of things. But I think one of the important components of this, and it should be part of the discussion, particularly if a committee takes this up, is just project readiness. I mean, this really comes down to project readiness, the way I see it. A longer a project lasts on the MPO list, on the tip, keeps moving out, it ends up increasing in cost, right? And there's a lot of projects that are on the tip that end up getting shifted one way or another because they're not ready. And so I just think that, and again, being on the consultant side of things, but also representing several cities and towns and multiple projects, really what this comes down to, in addition to those other elements, is project readiness. And I really think that needs to be part of the discussion, particularly if a committee takes this up. We can talk about costs, we can talk about all these other things, but if the project's not ready, that kind of puts a wrinkle in the entire TIP process. So just wanted to add my 2 cents. Thank you.
Emily Teller.
Thank you for recognizing me again. I just wanted to say that I was very impressed with Matt's presentation, and I would like to speak for the equity aspect of your considerations. Let me do this. I obviously am always a advocate of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, and I noticed that there are lots of other rail trail speakers from Newton and Belmont and other towns that show up at these meetings. And I really feel for the people who can be affected by your decisions, who don't have the wherewithal or the time or the knowledge to show up and advocate for what they need. And I just would like to put that into the mix, because obviously some of the projects that were here really enhance people's lives and get them to jobs and other things that are really important. Increasingly important for us to consider that, and equity is a great term for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Teller, very much. Other comments, questions, concerns, issues? Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll support what Tom Bennett was saying with Mcgrath, to say that, you know, if the scenario that we're going with is reflecting existing commitments, do we not have an existing commitment to Mcgrath as well? Essentially, it's, you know, we need to we need to program it at some point, and it seems like, you know, if there is funding in 26, it seems like that is an existing commitment we would want to put towards. And to Eric's point about, you know, sort of waiting to see about a policy, I think there was a comment earlier about if things, you know, if we come up with a policy over, you know, the next year or the summer, that it could potentially apply to projects that are later on in the TIP, it wouldn't necessarily mean we are committing. I mean, I guess that's the question. If we are committing to cost increases and committing to projects that are in the TIP from, you know, now until 2026. So I don't think that, you know, putting in something like Mcgrath in 2026 and having a policy around the cost changes or readiness are necessarily in conflict. Thanks.
Yep. Jake?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'll echo what Daniel just said. Again, I think Mcgrath certainly is a project that we as a body have committed to through the long-range plan, so I don't oppose seeing funding go there. If we have additional funding in 22, I think, you know, it's hard beyond that to decide who gets as a new project, new funding, but Mcgrath does have an existing commitment from this body, and I think we can respect that and still be fair to others who are seeking new funding. I guess I fall more on the side of, you know, if we're going to, and we can certainly discuss this if we're going to have a committee regarding it, but that, you know, new changes, I think I would err towards it being projects after 2026. I know I'll disagree with Eric a little bit on this. I think that the root of a lot of these cost overruns really goes back to, you know, oftentimes a project initiation, right? So I think it comes down to assumptions made at the very, very beginning in many cases. So I think it would just be tricky to take a project that's, you know, 3 years into the process and put a new set of you know, standards on that. But again, I'll leave that to when we have a more robust discussion, hopefully at a later date. Thank you.
Yep. Lynn?
Just so I have a question and then a comment based on the answer to a question. So Mcgrath is a multi-year project, right? Yeah. So if we program it in 26, then we're programming it through probably 29.
Yeah, I don't know how many fiscal years the project will take.
Okay, all right.
It's also a $150 million project. I mean, it's not going to be 13 now and 20 next year and we're good.
Right. So that's my concern about that. I mean, especially
it is sort of analogous to Rutherford.
Right. And my other concern about programming anything in 26 is that I think we would all, if we were going to make a bet, we would say that there are going to be more cost overruns. And so things are going to probably bleed into 26, and we're already looking at 0 and 26. Let me rephrase that. If we program something in 26 and we go down to 0, then any cost overruns are going to make 26 negative, potentially. So I'm very hesitant to program anything in 26. Thank you.
Thank you. So Matt, answer me a question. Is Rutherford the only project in the plan in those timeframes that hasn't been funded in the TIP yet, or is that Lynn project funded or not?
So right now, given the Western Ave project in Lynn was originally major infrastructure, but then we changed the way we categorize projects this fall. So it's actually since fallen out of our definition now that we changed that.
But it's still, you're answering your question I didn't ask, Matt. It's in the plan. We made a commitment to it in the plan. It is currently in the plan as adopted, yes?
We did, yes. We did make a commitment to that and to the Route 9 and 27 project in Natick.
Right. So I just want people to remember, again, Rutherford Avenue is incredibly important. I think it's a great project. I think it's important. But it's not the only project that we've made a quote unquote commitment to that we have yet to fund. There's also the Lynn project, which the mayor came to us 2 weeks ago and reminded us about. And then there's the Natick project, which people don't seem to have reminded us about. So maybe that's less important, but maybe not. Other comments, questions, concerns, issues? All right, so we're at a point where there's a $19 million gap, right, in FY22. But Lynn today said that they thought their project could be ready. And I believe that MassDOT has said, we're not 100% sure, but we're not necessarily opposed to moving it back into 22, right? And we still have some doubts, but we call it high risk now, not you have to move it. So how much does that cost, Matt?
Sorry, I think I don't have the number. It's like roughly 6.5 million.
Right, so that reduces that gap to 13 roughly. And then that increases, makes a $6 million gap in 23 then, is that right?
That's correct.
So in my head, if for the next meeting, you move Lynn back into 22, there's a $13 million gap, roughly speaking, in 22. There's a $6 million gap in 23, and there's a $13 million gap, roughly speaking, or 14 in 26. And then the MPO needs to figure out whether we want to program, whether any projects that have been submitted for consideration should be programmed and actually can be programmed in those years, whether the T wants to try to bring a different project forward, whether MassDOT wants to try to bring a different project forward, or whether we're just going to leave that money unprogrammed, right? That's where we are going into next week. But next week, you'll bring a scenario that just has those changes, right? Second question. Scenario 2 assumes we're going to fund all of the community connection applications. Is that true?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so I would like a little bit more discussion and presentation on that. Based on just what Sandy presented, I'm not 100% convinced that I'm willing to vote for that. And no, I don't get to decide. I'm just one person, but I'd like a little more conversation about some of those projects, because I think some of those projects I wouldn't fund even if we had all the money in the world necessarily.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely plan on bringing more of that information for discussion.
Excellent, because then maybe I'll be convinced that I was wrong and they all are good projects that should be funded. Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just about the community connections, I did have a question about how it was programmed, because I saw that the money was bumped up for the second year. But I don't know why you're not carrying higher numbers in later years to account for perhaps the second and third year of some of the projects. It seemed inconsistent with the way it was being programmed through the years. And that doesn't mean that, and I agree with David, that we from Federal Highway will, there has to be once the project is up and running, they have to show an air quality benefit. That means they have to sort of hit what they thought they were going to do in terms of ridership or whatever the project was. So that was because I do have want to just throw something on the table for an option for filling the gap in maybe 2022, is it? Rather than just adding more projects in, whether they're whatever, maybe it would be possible for the state to use more of the target money in 2022 for say the Sumner Tunnel, and then pay the MPO back in a subsequent year. I don't know if that's possible, but I'll throw that out there as an option rather than just adding more projects in. And something, David, maybe that's something we can think about also, if that's a feasible mechanism.
Thank you, Ken. Other comments, questions, issues? So there's been suggestion that we form some kind of ad hoc subcommittee. So people who are interested in discussing this policy as a subcommittee should let Tegan and I know of your interest. And then we will figure out how to whether and how to appoint that subcommittee and give you a charge. Any other questions, comments, concerns, issues at this time? Brian Kane.
Thank you, David. Can you just summarize for us sort of where you think we are and what we're going to do next week based on all of this?
Yes, and Matt Genova, you feel free to jump in if I say something that is wrong or that you disagree with, okay? Where I think we are, Brian, is there was a general sense of the committee that we want to proceed with scenario 2. There's an addition, new information today that Lynn has convinced MassDOT that their project can actually stay in 22. So Brian's going to move, not Brian, Matt's going to move the Lynn project from 23 back into 22 for presentation at the next meeting. That will still show, and he's going to keep all the community connections funded as they are for now, okay? So that will still show a gap in 22. I think based on my rough math, it's about 13 million bucks. That'll show a gap in 23 of about 6 million bucks. And that'll show a gap in 26 of 13 or 14 million bucks. We as an MPO will then decide whether we want to try to fill those gaps, and if so, what type of project might fill those gaps, all right? And then we're going to vote out a tip. And we're going to get a presentation, a little bit better, more, no, I don't want to say better, a little bit more detailed presentation on the community connections issues, because I just would like to, for one, like to have a sense to get a little more handle about what the benefits are.
All right, can I follow up and just ask how you plan to handle the $13 million gap for 22?
Right, so presumably there will be, I would assume, communities who might come and say, hey, my project that you don't think is ready, or hey, I've got a project that I just submitted that I actually think I can get ready for 22. You've opened the door for maybe the team might want to come and say, hey, we could actually spend $13 million if you want to give it to us, and this is what we would spend it on. Or the MPO might decide, let's leave the $13 million unprogrammed, because to Lynn's point and others' points, this year we had $11 million worth of cost overruns by the time we got to advertising our 11 projects, right? And given that we have decided as a policy, we're good for the money. If your project goes up, there's theoretically a chance that people's projects will go up. So you know, there's a whole host of ways to fund, and I would say that's true of filling any of those gaps, right? It's certainly more difficult, given our normal processes, to think we would pass a tip that would leave $13 million unprogrammed in the coming fiscal year, but it's certainly possible that we might decide to. Other comments, questions, concerns, issues? Seeing none, is there anything else on our agenda today? I don't think there is there? Are there any member items? Brian King.
Thank you, and I will be very brief. I would like to ask yourself and the staff to consider changing the way that we vote. I'm not sure we need a roll call for every vote. I think we do need a roll call, certainly at the beginning of the meeting. And I would ask that somehow some technology be brought to bear, or some other way, so that we're not taking so much time each meeting on roll call votes when most of them are unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I will ask staff to look into that. Any other comments, questions, issues, member items? Seeing none, I would just like to note, other people have said it today, but for the entire MPO, I'd like to say what a great job staff did today, and we appreciate it. That being said, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn? Please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Tom Bent.
I will second that motion.
Motion having been made and seconded. Without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Great job, everybody.